All right, there we go. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming to this sort of discussion-based Zoom meeting for Philosophy 100. I, usually would have had like a opening week meeting too, but at the end of the summer, I got really busy and it was just impossible to do that. So welcome to the actual first face-to-face time that any of us get to see each other in this class. I hope that it's helpful and that you like the class so far. Today, we're just here basically to talk about ethics. I'd like to see if any of you have anything that you'd like to discuss. We can talk about the first paper that's coming up that's going to be due next week. At the end of next week, I believe, on Friday. I'll be hosting office hours next week also, so people can just email me if they'd like to meet more to discuss more about how to write the paper, but we can talk about that today. And then other just general ethical inquiries, discussion about the abortion stuff. We can talk about cultural relativism and divine command theory or normative ethics, but probably won't talk too much about virtue ethics and the argument from Peter Singer, which is the last thing we're doing next week. Next week should also be a relatively lighter week of coursework, like reading and lecture-wise, so that you can work on your papers. All right, first thing I'd like to do. All right, I just put a link in the chat. If you can, please click on it and sign in. You can sign in now, or you can sign in at the end. I'll post it again if I remember. And that will get you at least like one, participation credit point, right? That'll go towards extra credit or just participation credit. It's extra credit because I can't require everybody to be here because this is an online class. But anyone that is here and that participates, it's like, great, good for you, and I'll boost your score as much as possible. We'll do this again two more times. Once to discuss things about epistemology. After that's the next section of the class, and then finally to discuss some things about metaphysics, which is the third section of the class. A few weeks before the end. All right, just getting started. Does anyone have any questions, comments, concerns? Want to ask anything right off the bat before we start talking about ethics? Feel free to use the put your hand up thing that you can do. I always forget how to do that, but it shows up in the participants. Oh, Blaine, do you have a question? Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Okay, awesome. Sorry, I was muted. I just had a quick question about one of the quiz questions.
Sure.
Regarding the trolley explanation. I didn't really get a definitive, I didn't really think there's a definitive answer as far as the question went. Maybe I was reading something wrong, but
so I think at least the question that was in the quiz was supposed to be something along the lines of why is the trolley problem a problem for utilitarianism, or at least like direct utilitarianism. And the reasoning is supposed to be that when it comes to individuals' intuitions, it's normally recognized that people think that in the case in which you just have to pull the lever to save 5 lives, that you should do that. People think, yes, that's the right thing to do. That's the thing that you would do in that situation. Whereas in the other situation where you have to push the large man off the footbridge, people think no, their intuition is no, that they wouldn't do that. And then the issue for direct utilitarianism is that the results are the same in both cases, right? One person dies, 5 people survive. And so the issue there is supposed to be, if utilitarianism is correct, then you should both pull the lever and push the large man. Whereas Whereas because, it seems like you should pull the lever, but you shouldn't push the large man, it seems like there's a disconnect between the two cases.
Okay, my apologies. I read that wrong. I was
Yeah.
like thinking that it was like immoral to pull the lever each way and
It's all right. No, it's
not do anything.
it was kind of set up to be confusing too. And then all of the answers to the question were like, it's immoral or it's moral to pull the lever or, push the large man. And so you had to like work through it a little bit.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. Cool,
Yeah,
cool.
no worries. Anyone else have anything? Because this is a good sort of jumping off point. I'm also happy to use people's, and we'll see. If people don't have a whole lot to say, I might go look through some of the discussion posts because people had pretty good things to say there that to help sort of jumpstart any conversation. But to begin with, I guess the one thing that sort of hopefully most of you actually really need to know is what to do in your paper. So in the first paper, and that's kind of the easiest way to start talking about ethics too, is to start talking about ethics as we started the class, which was, so we did sort of a practical ethical issue, the issue of abortion, which is super relevant once again, like it hasn't been relevant in like 30 years. And now it's like back on the table because of the Supreme Court being a giant mess and the state of the great state of Texas really hating on women. Like what a giant mess. Or should I say really loving unborn fetuses? I don't know. But yeah, so hopefully you've all had a chance to read over the paper prompt. I do want to sort of re-emphasize that you need to follow the prompt instructions closely. I don't know why this is, but every time I teach this class, I get like 4 or 5 students that write an essay on abortion, and it has nothing to do with what I asked them to write in the essay prompt. They just write an essay where they talk about abortion. It's like, okay, cool. That's great. Good for you. That's like, I now have read your blog post, right? But I needed you to do this thing that I asked for, right? I need you to basically take this argument that I discussed in lecture and think about it and explain it back to me, showing me that you understand it, and then pick a side, like show me why you think it's wrong, or what you think can be said about the argument. And that's sort of an important skill to learn how to do. It's basically an analytical skill, a writing skill that teaches you kind of how to take some idea that is presented to you in some way, pick it apart, put it into a formal argument that has structure, and then explain that structure, and then explain what's right or wrong with that structure, explaining why people accept it, the argument in one way or another, and why someone might reject it in one way or another. So I just wanted to sort of quickly go over the 2 arguments that are relevant for the paper. Does anyone have any questions before I jump into that? All right. Oh yeah, the other thing I was going to say, feel free to post, if you don't want to speak, that's okay. Feel free to post questions in the chat, but I will read them aloud so that they get recorded for posterity, and then I can talk about them. Let's see. All right, can everyone see the shared screen? This is the first writing assignment. And I'm just, yeah, if you haven't, be sure to watch this video. It explains what's going on in the writing assignment. And here are the 2 arguments that are relevant to the assignment. It's Thompson's violinist argument, which is an argument that abortion is permissible in some cases. And the future like ours argument, which is an argument that abortion in what we might call a normal case or a common case is immoral. Now, these two arguments actually aren't perfectly on opposite sides of one another, right? It's possible, given that the future like ours argument is correct, like if it were a correct argument, it could still be possible that Thompson's violinist argument is correct. The idea being that the violinist case is a case of an uncommon case, right? Particular cases related to that, right? So like a case in which someone might die if they don't have an abortion or something like that. However, these are kind of what I see as the two most plausible arguments, one way or another, for the two different positions that have kind of come to the forefront when thinking about the morality of abortion. On the one hand, it seems rather plausible that abortion is permissible in certain cases that are, difficult to deal with. Whereas it also seems like there's some reasoning behind the idea that ultimately the future existence of a person should be considered something of value, right? That's like part of why we treat children as well as we do is because if you do something awful to a child, you're really like harming their entire future. And given that kind of, core value that we seem to have, it seems like that value should also be, we should also be thinking about that value with respect to fetuses. And so if we are thinking about that value with respect to fetuses and it's wrong to do something detrimental that takes away from an individual that has that kind of possible future, that seems like something that's immoral. Now, whether or not these two arguments, there are reasons for thinking both of these arguments fail in certain directions. And that's ultimately what I want you guys to push on. So let me just kind of say a couple things about each argument. First, the violinist argument, you have to pick one of these two premises, premise one or premise two, to argue against the violinist argument. Now, this argument is difficult to argue against, but it's not impossible. And the basic idea here is to argue either that really in the end, it's not permissible to unplug yourself from the violinist, or to argue that the violinist case and a case of pregnancy due to rape are not actually analogous to one another. Those are the two options, right? If you pick the first, then you're denying premise two here, right? You're saying, actually, it's not permissible to unplug yourself from the violinist, contrary to everyone's normal intuitions, right? Remember the violinist case, you get plugged into the violinist, you wake up the next day, the doctor says, we can't unplug you without, killing the violinist. And you think, hey, I can unplug myself. Question being, is it moral or immoral to do that? Most people tend to think, yeah, you can unplug yourself. But there are probably reasons to think that you shouldn't unplug yourself. You can go back and think about cases. You can change the case, right? Imagine you only had to stay plugged into the violinist for 1 hour, for one day. It would seem pretty, I don't know about immoral, but you wouldn't be a very good person. You wouldn't be doing anything above and beyond for the violinist. You might be a jerk if you don't stay plugged into this guy for a day, if that's going to save his life. And then you can build arguments from that. There's a slippery slope argument right there waiting to happen. The other case is it's a little bit trickier to sort of suss out, but it's possible. In explaining what it is to say that the violinist case is ultimately not actually analogous to a case of pregnancy due to rape. That's the kind of situation in which you want to say something like, look, there's this difference between these cases that's so serious that it creates a moral difference in how we should judge the cases, right? The thought being that in the violinist case, the moral difference is like allows you to unplug yourself from the violinist, whereas in the case of pregnancy due to rape, you're not allowed to procure an abortion. You wouldn't be allowed to disconnect yourself from the fetus. There has to be some serious enough moral difference. So I think I discussed some of those in lecture as well. Things like, hey, you're not actually related to the violinist when you are related to your fetus, or I don't know. There's lots of different kinds of ways of thinking about that case. So does anyone have any questions about the violinist argument? Yeah, go ahead, Blaine. And then Evan. And then if anybody else raised their hand, I didn't see it. Go ahead.
Did Evan want to go first, or?
You can go first.
You can go for it, man.
Cool. I was a little confused on are we allowed to agree with the Thompsons violinist argument, or?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so the idea here is to pick one of these arguments for your paper, and the one that you agree with less, I would say, is the one that you should probably pick, because it's going to be easier for you to argue against.
Okay, but I mean, because I wrote most of the paper and I was just wondering if I need to rewrite. Can we go off the premise of like premise one in agreeing, and then overall, I don't want to say I disagree with some parts of the violinist argument, but not the whole entirety.
Yeah, so that's fine, as long as you can say why one of the premises is problematic or false as it is. You could say something like, hey, I agree that abortion is permissible in some cases. Like, I agree with the conclusion, but I think that this is a bad argument for that conclusion.
Awesome. And then also, does it have to be one of those 4 premises, or can it be something from the Thompsons paper?
So you have to relate the thing from Thompson's paper to one of these premises, and it really has to be either the first premise or the second premise, because the third and the fourth one here are basically conclusions, and these are like airtight, right? It's, if it is permissible to terminate a pregnancy that's the result of a rape, then it's permissible to have an abortion in some case, right? Because that's just one particular kind of case. So the question's got to really come down to whatever you find objectionable in Thompson's article. How does that relate to the specific argument as it stands?
Awesome. Okay. Cool.
Go ahead, Evan.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I hope I'm not getting too ahead here, but I've had a question for a while about the flow argument.
Yeah.
And I don't understand how it can operate on the basis that we're taking away a possible net positive by doing the abortion, because it seems to ignore the fact that we know how the woman feels, and we can better conclusively determine what future she has and her contribution to society, whereas we have absolutely no idea what this fetus is going to turn into. For all we know, it could turn into a monster.
Yeah. So that's fine, but that's literally screened off by the way that the argument is set up. So first of all, it's worth always to kind of taking into consideration the issue that ultimately all of these arguments are just about pregnancy and not about raising a child, because ultimately that's the whole game here, is that the question isn't about whether or not, if you were forced to raise a child until they're like 18, then it's a way bigger, like more difficult question to answer, right? Whether or not it's permissible to have an abortion in that situation. But just this is like assuming we have an acceptable adoption program that's available for people. If the question ends up just becoming a 9-month period of being pregnant, and the things that come with
a long period,
stuff like that. Yeah, it's still long. It's just it's a different question. Second, so we can screen off what we might think of as uncommon cases where like the idea of like, well, shouldn't Hitler's mom have had an abortion because it would have actually led to way more happiness in the world? Like stuff like that, right? It's like this person is going to be a monster. We didn't know it then, but ultimately, if only somebody had killed that person as a fetus.
Right. I mean, I'm not saying that.
No, of course.
Obviously, there's no way they could have known.
Yeah. But so what I'm wondering here is you're trying to bring up this idea that the future of the woman is somehow also valuable, right?
I'd argue it's more valuable with
Okay.
what we know, given that most logical decisions follow a path of knowns.
So the woman's future isn't at stake in the case of pregnancy or abortion, right?
That's arguable.
So any case in which the woman's future is at stake also counts as an uncommon case of abortion, right?
Okay.
That's the whole idea of talking about. So yeah, let me just start talking about the flow argument. Did anybody else have anything that they wanted to say about the violinist argument before we move completely over to the flow argument? No. We can come back to it.
Okay.
Well, yeah, we'll come back to it. All right, so let me just discuss the flow argument and then we can get off and running and keep talking about other things too. Oh, somebody said something in the chat. Clarify, we picked the one we disagree with most. Sure, yes, Lexi. So to clarify, the best way to write this paper, do not write a paper that talks about both of the arguments because that would take too long. An 800-word paper, you should basically just be picking one argument. You got to explain the argument pretty fully, and then you got to say what you think is wrong with it. Even if you don't disagree with the argument on the whole, if you can basically just pick something about the argument that you think is wrong or problematic, or that you could pick a fight with it, like somebody else could. All right. So the flow argument goes like this. If someone deprives something of a future like ours, then they've done something immoral, right? The idea being a future like ours is this thing that is extremely valuable, and to deprive something of that valuable thing when that individual would have received that valuable thing just sort of by letting it continue to exist, then it's immoral to sort of deprive it of that thing, right? So you just take any normal situation that's similar to that, right? So like suppose a baby is going to have a nice childhood if you don't, do anything bad to the baby. So doing anything bad to the baby would deprive that child of that childhood, and that seems immoral. So, okay, seems plausible enough. Depriving something of a future like ours is to do something problematic or immoral to that individual. Common cases of abortion. So that's the big term, the big phrase here. Common cases. Common cases is restricted. It restricts the kinds of cases of abortion, pulling out anything where the mother's life is on the line. We can restrict it to cases where rape isn't the creation of the fetus. That is an uncommon case of a pregnancy, and so thereby an uncommon case of abortion. We can also restrict out, as we desire, cases in which the person that would be born would end up being an atrocious person, or someone that actually ends up living a horrific life. We can literally just, by fiat here at this point, restrict out those cases, right? Suppose that someone's going to be born and they're just going to have like medical problem after medical problem, and their whole life is not really going to be worth living. Well, that's an uncommon case of existence of a human being. And so it's an uncommon case of a person being pregnant and giving birth to that kind of person. And so we could say, oh, that's also an uncommon case of abortion. All we're trying to talk about here in this case, for this argument's sake, and why the argument ultimately is kind of strong, are what I've coined in the lecture is common cases of abortion, where common cases of abortion are cases of abortion where the purpose for abortion, for having the abortion, is a notion is a kind of convenience, right? It's a life convenience where the idea is, look, my life's not going to go the way I want it to if I don't have this abortion, right? Like I'm going to have to put school on hold, or I'm going to have to like live in a funnier situation for a little while, or I'm going to have to interact with this guy that I had a one night stand with, or like something like that, like situations where nothing terrible is happening, but everything becomes much more inconvenient, right? That's like a common case of abortion that is interesting relative to this argument. And if we can then say, okay, common cases of abortion like that involve someone depriving a fetus of a future like ours, then common cases of abortion involve doing something that's immoral. All right, so that's how the argument is supposed to go. And I gave you some reasons for thinking that each of the premises are plausible. And this is basically how I want your paper to be too. If you pick this argument, you need to explain each premise. You need to say why the premise says what the premise says, and then explain why people think the premise is plausible, why people think that it might be true, why this argument has some force to it. And then you want to say, well, but there's a problem, right? And then that's where you say, okay, so for this argument, you also need to pick premise 1 or premise 2 to discuss and argue against. And then there's kind of, again, 2 different ways to do that. One, you can argue against premise 2, saying that common cases of abortion involve depriving someone of a fetus of a future like ours. Well, it's kind of hard to argue against this, but what you might do is a sort of sidestep and argue in some way that there just aren't really common cases of abortion. What is it to say that there aren't really common cases of abortion? Well, it's to say something about how ultimately all cases in which an abortion is on the table is a case in which, as Thompson points out, is a case in which there's a fetus that has this need, right, to continue living in a womb, but it doesn't have a right to that need unless it's been given that right by the woman that's pregnant, right? And that's supposed to be kind of Thompson's point at the end is, look, the fetus doesn't just naturally by fiat come to have this right to use the body in the same way that the violinist doesn't. And because of that, ultimately, the woman has to give or sort of proclaim, that the fetus, just decide to keep the fetus, just to decide that the fetus has the right to stay and allow for that. And if that's the case, right, if the idea is like, well, in no common case of abortion has that happened, then there just really aren't these common cases of abortion. That's one way of thinking about it. It's like a common case doesn't, there just aren't these real common cases. A common case would have to be a really weird case in which someone was like, yeah, I'm getting pregnant and I'm gonna carry this, like a woman like giving the fetus the right to stay and then taking it back. And that would seem strange, right? It's like, yeah, I'm gonna get pregnant, I'm gonna have this child, and then like, oh, it's become inconvenient now, so I'm not. I mean, that maybe does seem like a problematic case. You could imagine a scenario in which that would be a bummer or immoral. The other thing that you can argue in the flow argument is you can deny premise 1. If someone deprives something of a future like ours, then they've done something immoral. How could you do that? You could make the case that sometimes depriving something of a future like ours is not doing anything immoral. So you can accept the idea that, yeah, in some cases, depriving something of a future like ours, it is immoral, but in other cases, it's not. And so in particular cases of abortion, even in common cases of abortion, it's not the case that you're doing something immoral merely by depriving that thing of a future like ours. So that's a position that you could take, and you can do that by making that argument by basically pointing out situations, examples, counterexample situations in which you can imagine what it would be like to take away someone's future like ours and not having done anything immoral to them. So like, I don't know, one example is like well, at least, an obvious example is like when we give people like, so take like a 17-year-old kid that commits murder. They're going to get tried as an adult, and they're going to probably end up getting locked up for the rest of their life. That's a situation in which we're depriving that individual of a future like ours. But we haven't done anything immoral in that situation, right? Now, that, of course, is one of those cases in which, we need to think about what the other person has done. In the case of abortion, the fetus is, of course, neutral, like morally neutral. It can't do anything. So it's like you can't justify why you could take away the future like ours in that way. So you'd need to like think a little bit deeper about cases in which this sort of same thing might happen. But that's the kind of argument that you could run, denying premise one here. All right. Does anyone have any more questions? Evan, have I sufficiently gotten to your concern?
Yeah. Because I guess that was going to be kind of my angle was, how do you determine what's common? How do you measure that? Like realistically, on first glance, it seemed to me limiting, and that served to make the flow argument a little stronger. But when I was thinking about it more, and I was thinking about, well, how do we measure that, and what even is a common abortion? Yeah. I found like that seems like a really subjective viewpoint, and for a premise to be so easily interpreted as one thing or another, I don't see a lot of like concrete strength there holding the foundation of that argument.
So there is one thing to think about here, and that's something that, I don't know. It just depends. It depends on where I teach this class, right? So I've taught this class at UCSB before, and I've taught this paper, and it's always surprising to me when I ask students, like, do you think abortion is morally permissible in all cases? And they all jump up and say, yes, always permissible. And then I say, well, wait a minute. What about a case in which like a baby is about to be born? Like, it's 1 day away from the baby's being born. Is abortion permissible then? And then everyone's like, oh yeah, I forgot about that, right? So that's a case in which abortion is probably not permissible, right? You might as well give birth and give it up for adoption. You're going to have to go through the labor anyways, right? Like there's all these issues with that kind of situation. Now, the future like ours argument is a good argument against certain cases of abortion. The issue then becomes, what cases is it good for and what cases is it not good for?
I see.
And then a very interesting paper would be arguing about what common cases means and where the line maybe should or shouldn't be drawn, right? And that's a great way of saying this. Like, you deny premise two in certain cases and you accept premise two in other cases, right? So common case of abortion in which, like the mother is like, it's like a 1 month out, right, from giving birth. And the mom's like, you know what? I really want to go to Paris with this hot guy that I just met. Like, no, right? Like that seems immoral. In that case, it's like problematic. Like that's a case of an extreme case of privilege and ease of life or something like that. And that seems like it seems problematic, but why does it seem problematic is worth kind of sussing out. Whereas in cases in which, the person's like, no, I can't give birth now and have a child because that would, put my college plans on hold and that would change the whole future trajectory of my life. Like that's maybe a different kind of case, right? That's the kind of case that we commonly think of as a case in which, abortion is justified maybe, but, other people think, no, it's definitely not in that case. And then the question is, well, why? Like, how do we draw the line between ones that fall into cases that are immoral and fall out of cases that are immoral?
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting way to approach it.
Yeah, but yeah, so that's like, there's lots of open avenues for writing these papers. So what I would suggest though is really spend a lot of time explaining the argument and explaining what you mean by the argument, like explaining each premise. The discussion section sort of at the end where you get to argue your own point of view doesn't need to be there very long. Really what you need though is just to pick a premise that you think is problematic in some way and really do a good job explaining why you think it's problematic and not just saying I disagree with it or something like that, right? It's got to be like you need to give me a reason for thinking that it's
Sure.
worthy of being disagreed with, and maybe like how it could be fixed up or where the line really is.
Okay.
Does anyone else have any questions about the future like ours argument? All right. Blaine, did you want to jump back in with your question about the violinist argument?
If I can, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, go ahead.
So while we're trying to explain why it is permissible, say for like the first one, or the first claim,
Yeah, the first premise.
Can we throw in new concepts that aren't really, I don't want to say they're not proven, but they're definitely like tangible. Like I can explain mine if you want me to.
What exactly do you mean? Like what concept are you trying to appeal to?
So what I was trying to explain to agree with the first premise was to compare it to like a threat to like national security.
Okay.
As far as like, you don't know who the rapist is and what their intentions are. I feel like you can compare it to like history, like Vikings and like Genghis Khan and the Mongols and how they used rape and pillaging to basically genetically conquer countries without sustaining them because they didn't have the resources to.
Yeah.
Why they wanted to spread their seed in a negative aspect.
What's the but so what is that? That's to help justify premise one? Like you're appealing to that as
it is permissible, yes. Because if it's from a rapist genetic seed or genetic realm from like rapists, then it should be permissible to, I'd say, to cut.
That's okay. So this is the premise is that it's permissible to unplug yourself from the violinist. Like given that, which people seem to accept, then it's permissible to terminate a pregnancy due to rape. And so really there, the idea is just supposed to be that the violinist case and a case of pregnancy due to rape really do match when it comes to the moral facts. The idea here being like this. So it's like you take two situations that are vastly different, right? In this case, you know, in one case you have a horrific act of rape occurring to someone. In this other case, you have this very strange sci-fi situation where you get plugged into a violinist. These are very, very different situations. However, according to Thompson, there's a moral similarity between the two cases. And that's kind of why she constructed the violinist argument in the way that she did, right? In order to capture the moral similarity between that case and a case of pregnancy due to rape. So that was kind of her point. And then the idea is to say, look, because these cases, while vastly different, are morally analogous, then we should treat them in the same way. And the idea being that if it's permissible to act one way in one of these cases, then it would also be permissible to act that same way in the other one of these cases. Now that's what the premise is trying to say. And then what you want to do is basically explain that, some of what I just did, and then give more reasons for thinking why somebody would think that premise is plausible. Saying stuff about how, like what is exactly the same between the two cases, right? In the one case, a woman is impregnated against her will. In the other case, a person is, plugged into the violinist against his will, like other things along those lines. Does that make sense?
Yes. So basically what I was trying to do is went a little too far, or should I just try to connect?
No, I think it's totally fine to use examples. Just try to be very clear in
Specific.
how your example justifies or makes more plausible the particular premise that you're trying to argue, or to explain in that situation.
Okay,
That makes sense.
that's perfect sense. Yeah, I can.
Great. Anyone else? Any questions? Here, let me stop this. Anyone else? Anyone have any further questions about either of the arguments or anything else ethics related at this point?
Yeah. I just had one question about one of the quiz questions
Sure.
for the third quiz. It was the one that said, suppose that God exists and is omnipotent and all powerful. Can God create a boulder that is so heavy he can't lift? I said, yes, God can do anything. I just was wondering if you could elaborate on why that was wrong.
Sure. Well, so I discuss it in the lecture. And the idea here is this. So there's this saying that people often bandy about, which is that everything is possible with God, or something like that, right? Now, what exactly does that mean? Everything is possible with God. Does that mean that God can create square circles? Does that mean that God could make 2 + 2 = 5? No, right? It doesn't mean that, because those things aren't actually possible to begin with, right? Everything that's possible with God, if you believe, God exists, is not supposed to mean that God can do like anything, including things that are not possible, like make contradictions true, or make things that are one way, another way, that fundamentally don't work together, right? Squares have corners and circles don't, and so it's not possible for something to be a square and a circle at the same time. That's just sort of a fact about logic and how possibility works, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's restricting God's power, because God's power, insofar as God is supposed to be all powerful, is just supposed to be restricted to all of the possible things that could possibly be done, right? So God, everything is possible with God. Sure, everything that's possible is possible with God. That doesn't mean that everything that's impossible is somehow possible with God. Now, possibility gets sort of stretched really thin when we're thinking about these really abstract things. There's, of course, like different kinds of possibility, like physically possible, mentally possible, like could you get your emotions in the right order? But this is like pure possibility, like logical possibility, or mathematical possibility in some sort of very abstract sense. So then, to bring it back to this case, the idea is supposed to be something like this. God creating a boulder that's too big or too heavy for him to lift is something that's just not actually possible. And so God couldn't do it, but that's because there's lots of things that God can't do, right? Like he can't make square circles.
Okay, so it's more of the argument that like God can't change reality after it's already been made, I guess.
Well, yeah, in a sense, it's not, because God could probably change reality as it is, but he couldn't change certain aspects of it. He can't take things that are certain ways and subvert them into other ways, because those things are so basic in a certain way, right? So like, yeah.
Well, I don't know. Sorry, I was just thinking, because like I read it more as like a either way it would make God not all powerful, because
so that's supposed to be the argument from the other side, right? This is actually an argument from atheists that they tend to run, where they say something like, look, having an omnipotent God, that's nonsense. It's nonsense, because if God is omnipotent, he should be able to create a boulder that's so heavy that he can't lift it. And then that's like, oh, wait a minute, that's you missed the point, right? That's supposed to be the response that the theist has to the atheist at that point. They say, look, no, just because God can't create a boulder large enough, heavy enough that he can't lift it, doesn't mean that that's a restriction on God's power. That doesn't mean that God's not omnipotent. omnipotence itself, being all powerful, only reaches as far as what's possible to do in the first place. Right.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes more sense.
And yeah, and then that whole argument is just supposed to basically be an analogy argument to sort of use this, the same thing going for the Euthyphro dilemma. The Euthyphro dilemma initially is supposed, for people that are theists, and I had this view for a long time myself when I was growing up. The thought was, look, God created everything, so God created morality, so morality depends upon God. And that that might be true in some respects, but it's not true that God can just sort of willy-nilly change morality, right? And the thought there being that in some sense God is still subject to the structure of morality, in the same way that God is subject to the structure of what's possible, right? God's power doesn't go beyond what's possible, in the same way that God's decision making with respect to what's right and wrong doesn't go beyond what's right and wrong.
Yeah. So it's almost like if God made all the moral rules in the beginning, then they're not subject to change then based on if God wanted to change them all of a sudden.
In a sense, yeah, that's one way. So there's one of the classic ways out that theists have used to try and get away from the Euthyphro dilemma as is to say, look, actually, there's this thing, God's nature. And God's nature is this very kind of mysterious entity, right? It's the way God is, and the way that God is that he's all good. And because that's the way that God is, it fixes, in one sense, all of morality as we know it. And so God couldn't change his nature, and so God couldn't change morality. And that's a way out of the Euthyphro dilemma, because in that case you've got a third choice where you basically get to say, look, morality depends upon God, but God also kind of can't willy-nilly change morality. The problem with that argument is that it appeals to something that is vastly more, controversial and mysterious than the other options, right? Yeah. And it's great as a response, but if in arguing for something you have to kind of punt to appealing to something that's a conspiracy theory or something that just not a lot of people really know very much about or is difficult to understand, then usually at that point the person you're arguing with is totally allowed to just throw their hands up and say, well, I don't know what the heck that is, right? So it doesn't affect me. It doesn't help me in this argument, right? Yeah.
What do you make of a conscience guiding someone in morality towards being like God? You know what I mean? Follow it. You know what I mean? Because I feel like in the end goal it would almost be to be as moral as God could be, I guess you could say, would be the goal. So then could a conscience serve as a guide almost?
Yeah. So there's actually this whole history of this basically idea. So think about it this way. How do you come to know what's right and what's wrong? Well, there's your parents told you, and society kind of tells you, you get brought up in certain ways. And then you have internal emotions, right? You see someone kick a dog and you're like, don't do that, right? That makes me feel sad. And so the idea being oh, that's, part of how we learn morality. Religious theologians for a very long time thought, well, we need to also explain how we get access to the moral, more complicated moral stuff that doesn't that stuff that we don't see in real life regularly. I mean, all of us have probably seen, murder happen on television, but very few of us have probably ever seen an actual murder take place. Imagine back in the day before there was television, nobody was seeing any of this stuff, but people still knew murder was wrong, right? How did they know that? There was this theory, it was postulated, called the sensus divinitatis theory, which is basically a theory that there's a divine sense, like seeing or feeling or touching or tasting that human beings have, that God gave us, where we can somehow have a connection to God's way of being, thinking, whatever. Some people call it like the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
And that idea is that basically God has a special kind of, I don't know, joystick that lives inside of you that helps him guide you when it comes to morality. And that's something like your conscience.
Yeah.
And then, that, I mean, that's an idea that people have had for a very long time. Whether or not it's plausible, I don't know. At the very least, I mean, if God exists, then he definitely has control over your emotions, right? But whether or not those like emotions are in line with God's plan for everything, I think that it is still up for debate.
Yeah. Okay. Can I just say one more thing? I find it very interesting because I've listened to other people talk about it too, and they talk about like how the conscience is like separate from you. You know what I mean? So it wouldn't necessarily be you, and it can disagree with you and even cause you guilt. You know what I mean? Yeah. So like, if it was part of you, then it wouldn't disagree with you, which I find very interesting.
That is an interesting point. So there's an entire, let's see, are we going to get to this? Yeah, I think we will talk about this more when we get to the metaphysics and philosophy of mind section, maybe at the end of the class. There's this classic debate in the theory of like motivation. Like, how is it that you actually get motivated to do things? One of the theories is this theory of the divided self. And the theory of the divided self basically has like, there are levels of consciousness. And, even contemporary scientists think that that's true with respect to like the evolutionary substructure that kind of gets us to do fight and flight and like find food and stuff like that. And then like the higher level cognitive awareness where we're able to do like rational thinking, math, complex future planning, projections and imagination, stuff like that. But there's good science even that's out there that says, no, look, we at least sometimes have these like two parts of ourselves that are in conflict, right? The part of ourself that says like, no, you shouldn't eat that cookie. And the part of yourself that's like, I want the cookie, right? Like, that sort of thing. But it's the same for all moral problems, right? Like it's the like, wanting to eat, like all of morality can in a sense be boiled down to whether or not you should eat the cookie.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a good point, and it's a worthwhile thing to think about.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah, Evan, you had your hand up. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah. I was listening to. I thought it was interesting. He was talking about what was it like what did he call it?
Divided self or conscience.
Yeah, just the control that God had over your decision making.
Yeah.
And my response to like that idea that people haven't been exposed to this, why do they know this is a bad thing? I think it comes it comes down to instinctual fears. We all strive to in a society where we feel safe. Mm-hmm. That's reflected across the board through progress and social progress, and at the cost of eventually personal freedom. And I'm not progress is bad or progress inhibits personal freedom, but sometimes personal can be inhibited in the name of safety, which in some cases makes sense for a developing society. But my point being, I feel most people are morally against that because they fear it happening to them themselves. So we, come up with this social contract, and that's why the majority of people don't want to go and murder people.
Sure, that's definitely
right. Because I'm sure there's been points in people's lives where if we lived in the Wild West, maybe it would have made sense in the moment to kill that person in order to serve yourself better. That doesn't make that person a psychopath. It's just that we know not to, because like I said, you don't want to be looking over your back for someone because,
there's a really, you're basically explaining, there's a theory that is basically put forward by Thomas Hobbes in this classic book called The Leviathan. It's basically like that. He thinks that pretty much all of morality just comes down to you trying to not get ganged up on by your peers. And it's an interesting view. And if I was teaching a whole class on ethics, we would talk a lot about that. That would be like a huge chunk of the class. Sadly, this class, we only got to do the like wham bam thank you ma'am version of ethics to get through as much as possible. But yeah, that's I highly recommend taking it like a specifically ethics related class where you get to talk more about ethical motivation theory. Like there's this whole question, like, does altruism exist, or is everybody what's called an egoist, where they're just out for themselves? And then there's this whole debate about whether or not when it comes to doing the right thing, the moral thing, you have to actually want to, like you have to have a desire to do the right thing, or whether or not you can motivate yourself to do things just because you know that they're the right thing to do, even when you don't want to inside of yourself, right? Like this is the kind of divided self thing again, where it's like, is it possible for you to sort of, go with your better self and do the thing that you don't want to do because you know it's the thing you should do?
Right.
That's good. Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions, comments, concerns at this point? I think up to this, up to now, we've had, this has been a good conversation. This has been a great discussion with you guys, and we covered pretty much everything that had to be covered just talking about the paper. If anybody else has any further questions, comments, or concerns about the papers, we can discuss that. Otherwise, and this has been an hour. I don't want to keep anyone longer than that. So thank you all for coming. But if you have any further questions, feel free to stick around. I'll stick around for at least a little bit longer, and we can keep talking about things if you'd like to.
Cool. Hey, you.
Oh yeah, here's the link again. If you just joined or you joined late, please go on the link and fill out that you showed up so that you can get your extra credit point towards participation. And for those of you that did participate and chat, thank you a lot. It's nice to see people's faces, even if it's only a couple of you, at the very least. And I wish we could do an in-person class, but damn it, COVID. Someday.
Yeah, thanks for thanks for holding this discussion.
Yeah, we'll do another one when we get to through epistemology, which is fun. We'll talk about the matrix.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.